I'm the VP of Solution Consulting for West Strategics and US Healthcare. Been with Palo Alto Networks for 13 years, varying different capacities. I've seen a lot of technology trends play out over that time. And I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite, Zero Trust. And I'm going to go over just, what is Palo Alto Networks' perspective on Zero Trust? How do we approach it? How do we see the industry embracing it? What trends do we see impacting it moving forward? And then some high level guidance before I hand off to the subsequent speakers to go into deeper technical detail. So I'm going to kind of start with the why Zero Trust. And the way I would frame this up, if you gave me no context at all and just kicked me out of bed one morning and said, hey, there's a customer down in the coffee shop, can you go talk with them? And just give them some blanket advice on what they could do that would have the most impact on improving their security posture. And just starting with that as the baseline, it would be Zero Trust. And the reason I say that, just looking at the breaches that Unit 42 has been able to study over the last 5+ years, it's exceedingly rare, in fact, almost unheard of for the asset of interest to be the initial entry point or exploit point into a network. You pretty much never see that. Whatever they want to lock up with ransomware, whatever data they want to exfiltrate, the attackers pretty much never get to that directly. The initial ingress point, more often than not, is an employee endpoint, or perhaps IoT. And if it's an employee endpoint, the most prevalent threat vector is business email compromise, or by far a phishing attempt. But everything we've ever seen is dependent. I mean, that takes something malicious to get that initial foothold. Now, from there, I mean, the attacker's got the advantage. They can start to leverage credentials, they can start to leverage applications on that, and they can start to expand and move laterally. And what makes that harder to detect is a lot of times that initial footprint that they had to get, I mean, that took some type of exploit, that took something malicious, but the subsequent movement around the network, the underpinnings of, just the mechanics of that movement may not in and of itself be malicious, so it's going to be harder to detect. So I always tell customers, I mean, if you could have just the baseline, and when we get into the 5 steps of Zero Trust, if you could just have segmentation throughout your network that regulates who has network level access to what systems, what data, based on group membership, specifics around the device that they're using, posture of that device, a couple of other variables. Even without getting into any advanced security inspection, if you could just have that construct in place, so that, say, somebody in the accounting department does not have RDP level access to a database server in your data center, or any one of those other examples. If you just had that in place without anything else, you just made the attacker's job exponentially harder. But I always say I've got the easiest job at Palo Alto Networks. I just fly around and tell people what they should be doing, and then I leave it to really smart people like Jared and Emma to actually make this stuff work. So what I'm going to talk about this is simple, but it's not lost on me. I mean, things like decrypt, things like putting in Zero Trust policies, it is not a simple or trivial matter. But where I'm going to start with is just how I've seen the landscape evolve as it relates to Zero Trust. So I started my career back in the 90s, and back then, well, I mean, there was no such thing as cybersecurity back then. It was just security and loosely applied at that. But it was a markedly easier problem to solve because pretty much all of the data I had to secure was in a single location, customer's data center. And everybody who interacted with that data more or less had to physically come on site to do so. Now, early in my career, we saw the advent of work remote, and that opened up another vector for accessing that information. And, people would talk about how much did that complicate, security policies. And to me, not really. Because at the end of the day, everything that I had to secure was still in one location. So I still had one well-defined perimeter, and I still had a pretty easy ability to implement any type of security controls. And in fact, you could almost say, at least, for somebody to access it remotely, there was a level of authentication. There was at least a level of secured authentication that wasn't required if somebody came into the office. You could just back then plug into an Ethernet port and pretty much have full access to anything on the network. Well, since then, we've seen this continue to evolve. I mean, we've seen the advent of BYOD going back to about 2010. So now your security policy has to factor in, is it a corporate-owned device? Is it a personal-owned device? We've seen a far greater prevalence of remote workers and job types going remote. Obviously, COVID opened a lot of that out. But I think the most impactful transition point that we've seen is just where is the data located? And that happened when customers went from having 100% of their data on-prem to now embracing the public cloud. So if I look at 99+% of my customers now, the ratios will vary, but pretty much every customer that I work with today, they've got some percentage of their data on-prem. They've got some percentage of their data up in the public cloud. Pretty much all of them are using a minimum of two public cloud providers. It's very rare that I see anybody that says, hey, we have standardized just on cloud provider A and we don't use anybody else. They've got some type of combination there. And then SaaS-based applications, which bring their own challenge. Because with SaaS, I mean, at least with a public cloud provider, you've got the ability to instantiate your security controls and the surrounding infrastructure. You don't have any of that with SaaS. You're pretty much reliant on whatever API access you can get and whatever security controls you can implement there. So with that starting as the baseline, that's how I orient myself to any security conversation. Because the first challenge I always make to myself when I'm thinking about security for each specific customer, can I offer 100% consistent zero trust policy controls, or you can say any security capabilities for that matter, regardless of the use case? So are my policies completely consistent if somebody is coming on-prem, interacting with data hosted in the data center, as they are if somebody is working remote, trying to access data hosted, say, up in one of the public cloud providers? Now, there's two different ways you can solve for that. And I have seen customers try and solve for that by using the inherent security controls for each one of the use cases. So if it's on-prem, they use a next-gen firewall, hopefully Palo Alto Networks, to implement their zero trust policy controls. If it's in the public cloud, they'll use whatever native security controls are available in those cloud providers to enforce a zero trust policy. And if it's a SaaS-based application, they'll use a CAS-based solution to implement security controls there. Now, let's just say hypothetically that every single one of these solutions there was no differentiation in terms of security capabilities. They were all 100% on parallel. I don't agree with that statement, but I work for Palo Alto Networks. I'm probably biased, so take that for what it's worth. But let's just take that argument off the table. Let's say that there's 100% consistent capabilities. Even with that being the case, Gartner cites that 99% of security breaches could have been prevented with the tool sets that were on hand had they been appropriately configured and implemented. Now, I think there's a couple of challenges you can parse out of that. Number one, it's incumbent upon the manufacturers, the vendors, us being one of them, to make it easier to consume our solutions. And as a byproduct of that, I mean, now I run the entire solution consulting organization for the West. We are putting a lot more focus into how do we make this more consumable. But taking that challenge, notwithstanding that challenge, now the real question is, what is the likelihood of having a misconfiguration if you're trying to maintain a zero trust or any security capabilities configuration across all those different solutions? If I'm trying to do it, in AWS, up in Azure, on-prem with my firewall, using whatever CAS-based solution I have for my SaaS solutions, the chances of having a misconfiguration that leaves you exposed goes up exponentially. And there really is no one place where you can go and say, what is my zero trust policy? The bigger concern that I've got now is you've also got a fundamental shift in security posture for any type of asset if you move it. And to me, I mean, that's one of my goals is anytime I work with customers, security should be transparent to the rest of the business. If you want to have an application hosted in your data center, if you want to have it hosted up in the cloud, when I work with a CISO, I mean, our job is to make sure that there's 100% consistent security capabilities, regardless of which scenario you go with. Now, from there, the business can make the decision. Do I want to do this in the cloud? Do I want to do it on-prem? I mean, there's cost, there's agility, there's a lot of other factors. My goal is to take security out of that equation. So that's one real differentiation for us at Palo Alto Networks. And it came, back, early days when I got here. So you're going back 12 years ago. One of the most strategic decisions we made was to take our hardware platform and release it as a VM. Because once we could release our hardware platform as a VM, now we could fit a bunch of different use cases. We could be a cloud-hosted firewall supporting a remote workforce. We could be a front-end firewall for any public cloud infrastructure. but having 100% consistent capabilities with our hardware platform offering, now I could pull all of those into one centrally managed solution. I could have one ubiquitous security policy, zero trust policy that applies regardless of the use case. So I'm glad that we took that step, and I think that that is a big fundamental differentiator. But now I'm going to pause, Victor. I wasn't sure if I saw anything pop up there. Was there a
Yes.
question?
Yeah, Elton. So one of the questions that we're seeing here, if you start your zero trust journey, which pillar or which area would you start? Network, endpoint, SOC. What would you mature first?
Well, look, I will take a leap of faith and just hope that most or everybody attending this is a Palo Alto Networks customer. Now, it's a interesting question, Victor, because there's a lot of places that you could start. But the one place I would encourage you to start, look, if you're a Palo Alto Networks customer today and consuming our Strata platform in any way, shape, or form, so I don't care if it's hardware, I don't care if it's Prisma Access, I don't care if it's the VM virtual firewalls, I would start assessing your data, and we'll get into the pillars of zero trust. So I'm going to kind of leave that out of this answer, just exactly how you go down this path. But I would operationalize zero trust on one of those platforms. Again, I don't care if it's our Prisma Access, VM up in the cloud, VM on-prem, hardware on-prem. Go through the mechanics of analyzing and assessing traffic, understanding who's interacting with this data or system under what conditions, deciding what is and is not, or should or should not be allowed, operationalizing that as a policy. And the good thing there, Victor, is once you've done it once, and I don't care where you've done it, it can be ubiquitously applied across your entire infrastructure. So from there, I mean, if I've done it on-prem on just a hardware firewall, I'll use COVID as an example. When we had customers have to transition to a remote workforce with 48 hours notice, being able to just lift all the policies from a hardware firewall, because the first thing we learned in that is most hardware front end VPN firewalls couldn't scale to 100. None of them were designed to support 100% remote workforce. But being able to take an entire security policy, not having to modify it and just move it up to our cloud offered firewall, which could offer that scalability. So to answer the question, Victor, I mean, I would start on the platform that you have today. You can then scale that across the different platform offerings, if it's in the cloud, if it's on-prem, if it's our virtual firewalls, whatever. That's how I would start with the exact policies of zero trust across the network. Now, you did kind of have an interesting opening there when you asked me about SOC and you asked me about endpoint, because now it's a really good segue into the next part that I want to talk about. So I've talked about how we've seen zero trust play. Now I want to talk about how we've seen a lot of trend impact zero trust. And with that, I'm going to talk about AI. And look, when you bring up AI, there's a lot of different facets to that conversation. There's how are customers using AI today to better operationalize different mechanics inside of their business. There's how do you secure actual AI solutions themselves. I'm not going to be talking about either of those. I am going to be talking about how do we see AI impacting the threat landscape today. And to do that, going back, I'd say, I've really seen two truly transformational technologies in my life, in my professional lifetime. So I entered the workforce back in the late 90s, and back then I was a network engineer. So just implementing route switch networks, and security was by and large an afterthought. You fast forward to 2006, 2007. That was my first job where I was 100% dedicated security. Lived out in Washington, D.C. at the time, supporting the civilian federal government. And back then, there was really not a lot of breaches. And my conversations back then were much, much different. It was mostly around compliance. Now, to be clear, there were breaches, there was malicious activity, but nowhere near at the scale that we're seeing it today. Not even marginally close. And looking back at it, I always wondered why. Because if I think back again, you're thinking around mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, somewhere thereabouts. Everything an attacker needed existed. I mean, the ability to encrypt data and charge for a decryption key, that was there. The ability to exfiltrate data, that was there. And what an attacker had to contend with was markedly more rudimentary than what it is today. You probably had a layer 3, layer 4 firewall at the perimeter, not doing much more than that. You had an IDS because IPS really hadn't come to prevalence yet. So I mean, you had an IDS that was just logging potential threat activity with logs that nobody looked at, and you had an endpoint security solution with static signatures that were probably a couple of months behind any of the relevant threats that you were seeing those days. With all of that being in place, you still didn't see a lot of attacks. And looking back, it perplexed me. I kind of wondered why. There was one thing missing in that equation. The attackers didn't have a scalable, extensible way to extract payment from their victims. Cryptocurrency and specifically Bitcoin solved for that. And you can actually, if you go back, if you follow any of the trends, just going back to 2000 to today in security, just the amount of new threats that you're seeing out, the amount of new malware, the amount of new attack campaigns, all of that. It was a linear relationship up until cryptocurrency, and then it hockey sticked up because it solved for the problem of how can I scalably extract payment from my victims. In fact, if you go back to that time, anytime threat actors were caught, more often than not, it was almost always the financial forensics that got them, not the digital forensics. Because they had to find a way to get the money, they had to launder it, they had to pass it through different channels so you could trace the money. Cryptocurrency solved for that. And when cryptocurrency became prevalent, the cybersecurity industry absolutely took off. And go back and look, I mean, you can see that inflection point. We're seeing something similar right now with the advent of AI. In terms of how we are seeing that impact the statistics that Unit 42 looks at on a day-to-day basis in terms of the threat landscape. And I'll give you a few examples. The first one is just how quickly new threats are turned out. And to me, anytime you say just net new malware or any threat statistic, it's kind of like just saying, hey, crime is up in this neighborhood. I mean, I don't know, is that petty theft? Is that violent crime? I mean, what are we talking about here? And even now with AI, it's kind of forcing for me a new working definition of zero-day malware or zero-day threats. The traditional working definition is zero-day just means there is not a prevalent availability of static signature sets today that would detect and catch this. But most of what's called day zero malware is actually polymorphic malware. So it's existing malware that's modified just enough to invade an existing signature set. But most of that can get caught today with machine learning and advanced analytics. What is really concerning with the advent of AI is we're seeing just a huge uptick in what will be true day zero built from scratch malware with completely new techniques, attack techniques, completely new command and control infrastructure. Basically something that is completely new. Pardon me. So seeing that take off. The other thing that we're seeing is just how fast vulnerabilities are being targeted. So look, I've been in the manufacturing space for 2 decades, and look, CVE it's a part of life, and none of us love having to deal with it. But and just for certification, CVE. So anytime a new vulnerability in your product set becomes widely known, and when that happens, there's always two windows that a manufacturer has to work with. The first window is, you are notified responsibly, usually by the threat researcher, hey, we found this vulnerability and we're going to publish it. And you've got, 48 to 72 hours to frantically scramble, produce whatever patches you need to, work with your customers, get the patches in place. So that's window number one. Window number two is then this vulnerability is publicly announced. And window number two used to be a couple of days. You had a few days before you started to see threats prevalently targeting. We're now seeing when CVEs get released, I mean, from the time that they're announced, within hours, we're seeing those be prevalently targeted. And again, that just speaks to the attacker's ability to leverage AI to go after something. How much the attackers know about you is now markedly different. So when an attacker comes after you, I would assume that they, before they've even started, they know your entire security stack. They know what security solution you're running on your endpoint. They know what next-gen firewalls you have. They know what your threat detection systems are. They know what SIEM you have. They know what operating systems you have. They know what public cloud environments you're in. They know what database systems you use. And knowing all of this really isn't hard. I mean, you can know pretty much all or most of this just by scraping through job postings for a corporation for the last year. You look for any job postings under the IT, I mean, what skill sets are you looking for? That usually pretty much defines what they've got. Hey, we're looking for somebody with expertise in X, Y, Z, safe to assume that they have that. Anytime people at a company speak on behalf of a vendor, anytime there's a public release, so there's a ton of bowman, there's a ton of information out there that they can gather to know a lot about you before they've even, started, before they've even landed their first spot, they know a lot about you. We're seeing it right now in the sophistication of phishing campaigns. So I've been impressed with some of the ones that I've seen. I mean, you go back and they were just kind of spray and pray, and let's just hope we get lucky. Again, an attacker's ability to leverage AI to know a lot about their targeted victim, and really do something highly customized from a phishing campaign. I've really been impressed with what I've seen out there. And as a result, I mean, we're seeing even companies that invest in training, enable, and all of that, we are seeing them not able to keep up and getting exposed. I use myself as an example. If anybody had visibility into the sorry state of my fantasy football team, they know you send me a trade request with an even halfway serviceable running back, I'm smashing that accept button and I'm not asking many questions. I'd get popped. So these are all changes and impacts that we're seeing with AI, but probably the most concerning one, and I didn't share any statistics intentionally. Because I think a lot of times statistics detract from your conversation in security. I think as security vendors, we tend to barf a lot of them up on the screen and they just become background noise. But I am going to use this one, and I really am watching this one because my talk track has had to evolve markedly just in the last year. This is how dynamic this has been. So if I go back to about just a year and a half ago, Unit 42, looking at all of the breaches for 2024, they saw about one fourth of the breaches. The time from the initial exploit, the initial entry into the network, as I mentioned, they have to first get that entry point, that system compromised, to either the locking up or exfiltration of data was 5 hours or less. And so that's the window that you're working in right now to detect a malicious activity inside of a network is 5 hours or less. And that's not a lot of time. Now with the advent of AI, and again, I was wondering, how are we going to see that come down? I can remember early days talking on stage, like, we're going to see this become 2 hours, we're going to see this become 3 hours. We're already down to sub 30 minutes now. That is how fast they are able to move from that initial compromised endpoint to either locking up or exfiltrating what they want. So I'm going to take this back to, this is why I'm so passionate about zero trust. Having all of those constructs in place that make the attacker's job that much harder, and slows down that whole process. And then, Victor, you asked the question, I mean, how do things like SOC, how does everything else play at endpoint? How does all of this play into this? I'd say the one thing, again, if you can get that zero trust construct in place, you just made the attacker's job exponentially more difficult. Now from there, it's how do you leverage pervasive visibility and automation? Because as we're seeing this play out, the weak link is always going to be humans. Anytime you pit a human against a machine, the machine's always going to move faster. So you have to automate as much out of this as you can. And a big part of that is, how can I take all of my data and aggregate it, security data, everything from the endpoint to the network to everything, analyze it, draw assertions from that data, and make assertions, is this activity malicious? And it may be based off of in fact, it's most likely going to be based off of characteristics that you haven't seen before. So things that I'm working with my customers now is things, adopting our advanced signatures, so you can detect all of these advanced threats, and protect them in an automated fashion. Through our Cortex or our automated SOC offering, I mean, how can we help you develop a rigor around mean time to detect, mean time to respond, maniacally tracking these and shrinking it down into a window that's still relevant for what we're seeing in the threat landscape?
That's awesome.
So with that, Victor, I know that I said I threatened to use one slide. Looks like I made it through with 0 slides. I'm confident you all will get your share of slides going through this. If there are any questions, again, I know that I'm up against my time and I'm handing off to another speaker. But if you'd like to talk with me directly, just work with your account team. We'd be happy to have a conversation. And it's been a pleasure talking with you all today.
We appreciate it. Elton, thanks so much for your insights.